Hey everyone, Mr. Krieger again, and I'm excited because I get to introduce you guys to our new content. It is all about explorers. I'm sure many of us have gone exploring on our own, maybe in our backyards. I know when I was younger, my grandparents lived on a huge farm, and I loved exploring, going out looking for anything new, new animals, new creeks or streams to fish. And that's kind of the reason many of our early explorers, that's the reason that they went looking for new land because they wanted to find new resources, new land to grow their empire. And so I'm going to take you through a slideshow here, and it's going to talk about how most of the European countries, the reasons that they explored. And we call these the three R's or the three G's. And I'll explain that and you'll see here why. With the three R's being riches, religion, and reputation, or the three G's being gold, God, and glory. And so the riches, they were looking for gold. They wanted as much wealth as possible. They wanted as much land as possible. And with acquiring this new land, they were also obtaining new resources. They also wanted to spread their Christianity to other lands. And then the individual explorers themselves, they just wanted to become famous. They were thrill seekers and they wanted their name to be known. They wanted to become famous, and that is the reason that many of those individuals became explorers. So, the age of exploration, this happened 1,000 years ago, really. The first explorers I will talk about here shortly are the Vikings. Um, and then and then we've got a bunch of other European explorers, especially from Spain and Portugal. And at this time, um, well, the Vikings were about the year 1000 when they started exploring the Americas or North America, and then about 480 some years later, almost 500 years, other European countries started searching and exploring for those reasons that I mentioned earlier. And this was so long ago that they didn't have a whole lot of um, knowledge and idea of what these explorations, what they might encounter. So these are many obstacles that they faced. They didn't have maps. They were going to new places that nobody had ever been. Therefore, there was no map that could tell you where to go. They often ran into bad weather. It could cause rough seas and make it very, very difficult to travel. Supplies, they didn't know possibly how long they would be out to sea. And so if they thought maybe it would be a month and it ended up being a 2 month voyage, they could have easily ran out of supplies. Diseases happen very easily. They are exposed to diseases from insects. And this would often kill crew members or make them very, very sick. And just fear. Crew members were afraid of leaving their families to go to places they'd never been. They were actually afraid of just the unknown. They didn't know. Some of them thought there could be some crazy sea creature that could pop out of the ocean and sink their boats. And then, of course, enemies. They encountered natives who didn't want them on their land, and many of these explorers were going out to claim land, and they were trying to claim land for their mother country, meaning wherever they were from. So we're going to talk about some of the helpful and harmful things that explorers ran into, and you guys are going to take notes and make sure that you go over this later because this is going to be some very valuable information. So when explorers arrived in North America, they found that people were already living there, and many of these encounters were good, and many of them were not so good. Especially when they found out that there were people already living there, and they tried to claim their land. I mean, that's could you imagine me going over to my neighbor's house and taking the Krieger flag, sticking it in his front yard, and saying, "This land is mine." And that's kind of what the explorers did to the Native Americans. So let's go over the helpful and harmful interactions between these. So they shared things like weapons and farming, right? Farming tools. This would be very helpful. Native Americans taught many of the explorers how to grow crops. So to me, that sounds very helpful, and it is. Explorers claim land occupied by the Native Americans for their sponsor countries. That's kind of the what I just mentioned, and that would be very harmful. Native Americans are not going to take kindly to that. It is their land. They've lived there for thousands of years, if not longer. So that was very, very harmful, and that caused a lot of arguments and battles between the explorers and the natives. They traded goods and treasures, right? If you're trading, usually that means you have a good relationship, you trust each other, so that is very helpful. They spoke different languages, making it difficult to communicate. That would be harmful. It'd be tough to understand each other, especially if the trading, I'm sure they used a lot of gestures and nonverbal communication, but that would still make it very, very difficult and very harmful. They came from different cultures and religious backgrounds. If you come from different cultures and religious backgrounds, you're going to have different views and different perspectives. So that could be something that would be harmful to the relationships. And here are the outcomes of exploration. So this is kind of the overview of what happened because of these explorations. So new lands were discovered. This was great. I mean, a lot of natives were already living there, but they were newly discovered to Europeans. The expeditions of explorers provided new understanding of geography, and so they were able to create maps that were better and more accurate to this new land. They were able to trade between countries, and that helped their economy. And then by all this exploration, they were able to find ways to improve their shipbuilding. And so that definitely helped in exploration. And we'll talk about that a lot more to come. So let me go to the Viking slide. As I mentioned, the Vikings were some of the very first explorers. They were the first explorers to reach North America. Okay. So the Vikings, and I'm sure you guys have already have an idea of what the Vikings were. A lot of us have these preconceived notions that Vikings were terrible, terrible people, and they had these helmets with horns on them, which they didn't, and they were absolutely very, very tough people that lived in Northern Europe, and I'm going to show you guys that here in just a minute. Okay, so they're also called Norsemen, which just means men of the north, and that's where they came from, and I'll show you here on the map. They were the first ones to discover America. Um, they had very fast ships. They were very brave seamen. These guys were some of the most courageous men to ever live, and women, I should say, because there were some women Vikings. So a Viking, what that term means, is actually a sea raider, someone who raids, or a pirate, and many of the the pirates or these sea raiders did go out to conquer and I guess find valuables, which they just stole. They just took them. They lived in these communities, and they had chieftains or jarls that were in charge of these communities. And the jarls expected their Vikings to bring back all these treasures after these raids. And so many of these raids unfortunately ended in cold-blooded murder. If anybody got in their way, they absolutely would kill them without thinking twice about it to obtain these valuables. And a lot of the places that they went were actually monasteries or religious buildings, almost like churches that where priests live, and they had many valuable utensils and trinkets there that the Vikings would just take from them. Now, here's a map of where most of the Vikings came from. So, Scandinavia, you'll hear, that is Northern Europe, and it is this area: Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and even over here in Iceland. Many Vikings went from Norway and Sweden over to Iceland. Right down here is England, right? Great Britain, United Kingdom. So not too far from there. A lot of their voyages or expeditions led them over to England because there were a lot of monasteries that weren't guarded and they had a lot of valuables to take from them. And to get to these places, the Vikings had what are called long ships. And these were by far the most powerful seaworthy ship at the time. They were super, super strong because they were made of oak planks and they were really lightweight, so they could cruise through the water at amazing speeds. Um, they were waterproofed with seal blubber and oil and pine tar, so they could stay out to sea for very long periods of time. And it was shaped like a canoe, where most ships at the time could only travel in one direction, whereas the long ship could travel in either direction. So it made it easy for them to maneuver. And they were also very, very shallow. And what I mean is that they didn't have a below deck, they didn't have a storage area, and so it's very shallow. And so they could kind of just glide through the water. And they also had what is a keel. And so if this was the long ship, a keel would be underneath. It's kind of like a fin, kind of like what would be found on a surfboard. And this keel would help from the ship from, I guess, crashing or tipping over if there was very bad weather and huge waves. And so the creativity and the ingenuity of the Vikings at this time was pretty impressive because these boats were very, very amazing. And they used a lot of big, bold, bright coloring that was intimidating. Sometimes they had gold. They were usually led by this big dragon head to strike fear into the villagers that they were going to raid or loot. And here's another illustration of a longship. If you can see this kind of scary dragon head, and um, they were very fast because they did have this big rectangular sail, and they also could use their oars to row at the same time. Now, the first Viking that actually made it to North America, his name was Bjarni Jarlsson, and he was actually traveling from Iceland to Greenland to go visit his dad. And it's about a 450-mile journey. And over the course of the journey, there were some northerly winds that were pushing him down, and he got way off course. Ended up in northeast Canada. Checked it out a little bit, was completely confused, and figured he's like, well, I'm definitely not in the right spot. And he made it back to Greenland and found his dad, and actually ended up telling this story to a couple other very, very famous Vikings. Eric the Red was a very, very fierce, very well known Viking warrior. And he actually explored because he was a fugitive. He was banished and had to explore. And Bjarni had told Eric about his journey. And Leif was Eric's son. He'd heard about this journey and was very excited to go check out this new land that Bjarni was describing. So Eric, like I said, was banished in 982 from Iceland. So then he explored and settled in Greenland. And Leif the Lucky was Eric's son. He was actually the first European to reach and settle in North America in about the year 1000. And he called it Vinland at the time because the area that he found had a ton of grapes and berries that grew on vines or bushes. And so that's how it got its name. And Leif was very excited. He'd heard the story from Bjarni about 15 years prior. And so he'd dreamt and thought about making his voyage when he was old enough, strong enough, had a crew big enough, had enough people that wanted to go with him. Finally, in the year 1000, he decided to take that voyage and sailed over. And I'll show you here on the map. He was able to make it from Greenland and ended up down in this area, which is now called Newfoundland and Labrador. Um, and so he made it there, and was just kind of blown away at all the beauty and everything that was different there. The first spot that he made wasn't that great, so he kept on taking his boat farther south into different inlets, and then ended up eventually finding a really cool area that he actually settled, and like I said, called it Vinland. And he and his crew settled there for the winter. And to us, we think, oh my God, that'd be so cold settling in Canada for the winter. But it's actually a lot nicer weather there than it was in Greenland and Iceland. So he stayed there for the winter and then made his voyage back to Greenland, told everyone about it. Eventually, more Vikings made more expeditions back to that area in Canada, but they ran into a lot of Native Americans that lived there. There were a lot of battles. The Vikings eventually just kind of got sick of having to battle these Native Americans, even though the Vikings are known to be some of the toughest warriors in the world at that time. There were many Native Americans there, so they were kind of outnumbered. And after the fourth expedition and I think many deaths, they decided, hey, I think we'll leave that area alone. And the Vikings kind of stuck to their homeland of Greenland and Iceland and Scandinavia. And so that's kind of the story of the first explorers to find North America. Now, they didn't ever make it down into the United States, or what we call the United States now, but they did make it to North America, and they did name it and did claim that land for a little bit of time. And so there's the story of the Vikings. So hope